If you love epic tales of humanity defying the stars, hit subscribe and like. More cosmic legends await. For 20,000 years, the galaxy moved forward without humanity. The empires that came after them had long since erased their fear of the Terrans. They were studied in historical records, referenced as a cautionary myth, a once powerful species whose reach exceeded their stability, consumed by their own ambition and arrogance. But in truth, no one knew what had happened. Humanity had not died in war, nor perished by cosmic disaster. They had simply vanished, leaving behind only silence. In that silence, new civilizations rose. The assembly became the dominant force, a bureaucratic superstructure of species who considered themselves enlightened. They spoke of unity, of wisdom gained from the fall of the Terrans. Their textbooks framed humans as a warning, and their politics were built around preventing any one species from becoming too powerful. They thought the lesson had been learned. But deep in uncharted space, something stirred, a signal that didn't belong to any of the known powers, one that pulsed in a rhythm older than any current language. It was first detected by a long-range survey drone passing through an abandoned star system near the galactic rim. The signal wasn't coded in numbers or equations, it was music. Human music. The kind no alien could have created. The probe recorded only 30 seconds before failing. When the recovery vessel arrived, it found a ship. Massive, silent, ancient. Its hull bore no markings except a faded emblem, a stylized Earth, surrounded by a shattered ring. It hadn't broadcast a message. It hadn't moved. But it had made itself seen. And that was enough. They called it the Revenant. The news spread fast, faster than the assembly could contain it. Images of the ship circulated through fringe networks and dark relays. Worlds that had long speculated on humanity's fate began buzzing with theories. The High Guard labeled it a hoax. The Core Ward orders denounced it as a psychological weapon. But none could deny what the ship was. It matched no alien design. Its structure was unmistakably human, though built with materials that scanned as indestructible. No life signs. No communication. Just that music, and the steady pulse of a power core 20 millennia old. The assembly dispatched a diplomatic vessel. On board was Talon Mar, a xeno-archivist renowned for deciphering extinct languages and ancient signals. He was not military. He was not political. He was chosen because the assembly feared this wasn't a trick, it was a revelation. As the diplomatic vessel approached the Revenant, they received no challenge, no response. The ship simply allowed them to approach, as if expecting them. The closer Talon got, the more he felt the weight of something far larger than a ship. It wasn't a derelict. It was a monument. A statement. Initial scans revealed no crew, but internal systems were active, shielded from interference, sealed with encryption layers more advanced than anything known. Talon interfaced through a passive uplink and received only a single response, a stream of memory files. Cultural data. Archives of human civilization. Art. Philosophy. Earth's ancient languages. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a greeting. It was a mirror. When Talon presented his findings to the assembly, they dismissed them. They claimed the data could be faked. That no ship could operate autonomously for that long. But Talon knew better. He had seen patterns in the data that no simulation could replicate. The timestamps, the linguistic decay, the contextual shifts, it was too real. The ship wasn't just old. It had waited. And it wasn't waiting for contact. It was waiting for memory. The assembly began tightening control over the data. They blocked broadcasts, silenced researchers, and spread disinformation. But the truth had already escaped. Smugglers sold fragments of human history on open markets. Dissidents built cults around Terran ideals. On outer colonies, artists used the recovered data to resurrect long-dead human art forms. In less than a cycle, the Revenant had done more to shake galactic culture than any fleet in living memory. And it hadn't even moved. Then something changed. The Revenant began transmitting again, not outward, but inward. A local quantum burst carried directly to Talon's console. It contained a single line of text in ancient English. Observation is complete. Phase 1 initiated. Talon didn't know what that meant, but it terrified the assembly. They assumed it was the beginning of a threat. They assembled fleets. Not to fire, but to surround. The ship was labeled a Category Z anomaly, monitored constantly, and kept in isolation. But Talon wasn't convinced it was dangerous. He believed the Revenant didn't come to fight. It came to remind. And in doing so, it became more dangerous than any weapon. Because no power in the galaxy was built to withstand truth. The first cracks appeared on the mid-rim colony of Velar 9. After a data burst from the Revenant was intercepted by a local relay, archives long thought destroyed surfaced, showing the colony's original inhabitants had been displaced by a species now in power. Riots broke out. The ruling class tried to suppress the data, but the people had already seen it. Similar events unfolded on multiple worlds. The Revenant wasn't releasing military secrets. It was releasing shame. And shame traveled faster than light. It became clear that the ship carried not just records of humanity, but records of everyone. Wars, betrayals, uplift failures, early contact manipulations, all catalogued with terrifying precision. Humanity had watched the galaxy grow. And when they disappeared, they hadn't deleted what they knew. They had saved it, sealed it, and sent it forward. This wasn't a ghost ship. It was a judge. And now that judgment had begun, not with fire, not with invasion, but with memory. 20,000 years of silence had not been absence. It had been preparation. The galaxy's reaction to the ghost ship was confusion first, then fear. The Revenant did not behave like any known vessel. It had no propulsion signature, no crew, no demands. Yet it was undeniably alive, its systems pulsing with energy, its inner core cycling data across unknown quantum networks. The music that first signaled its presence had ceased, but in its place came something stranger, silent broadcasts filled with visual data, impossible to fake and unmistakably human. At first, the assembly tried to intercept and decode the transmissions privately. Their best decryption teams worked in isolation, hoping to filter and control the flow of information. But they couldn't keep up. The ship's signals weren't transmissions, they were memories, encoded records of human civilization, flowing in structured sequences across multiple bandwidths. Entire artistic movements, social philosophies, linguistic evolutions, Earth's mythologies, and interstellar diplomacy, all released, slowly, deliberately, like a tide that could not be turned back. Talon Mar was among the first to grasp what the Vault was doing. This wasn't a message to the galaxy, it was a mirror held up to it. The Revenant wasn't seeking communication. It was remembering, and in doing so, forcing others to remember as well. Talon's early reports were ignored by the Assembly's High Circle, then classified, then declared disinformation when they leaked. That only accelerated public fascination. For the first time in generations, common citizens were seeing history not through filtered archives but from the source, uncut, human, and uncomfortable. Within a solar cycle, at least a dozen major colonies had experienced unrest. On Valus Prime, protests erupted after a released human transcript revealed that their planetary government had been engineered by a now-extinct think tank funded during the earliest uplift trials. The local population had believed they'd evolved naturally into governance. Now they saw they were designed. Other worlds discovered ancient betrayals buried beneath state narratives. The Vault wasn't attacking. It was unveiling. The Assembly called an emergency conclave. The proposal on the table was clear: isolate the Revenant, disable its transmission field, and if necessary, neutralize it before more damage was done. But no one could agree on the method. The ghost ship had defenses unknown to current science. It responded to scans with electromagnetic static. It redirected targeting systems. It never fired a single shot, but somehow made entire fleets feel blind in its presence. Worse, it hadn't moved a meter, yet remained completely untouchable. Frustrated by diplomatic gridlock, a covert faction known as the Concord Initiative attempted a surgical infiltration. They sent in 3 stealth drones laced with quantum disruptors, aiming to disable the Vault's communication arrays. The drones vanished 30 seconds after entering its proximity. No explosion, no signal loss, just instant silence. Assembly monitors recorded a faint gravitational ripple, then nothing. And then came the first real response from the ship. A single word, pulsing across all open channels in galactic standard. Observed. No threats. No explanation. Just confirmation. The Vault was watching. It always had been. The impact was immediate. Debate shifted. If the Revenant was truly aware, then it wasn't a relic, it was an intelligence. One old enough and vast enough to have survived 20,000 years without error. The Assembly reclassified it as a level alpha continuity artifact and issued containment protocols, but the damage had already spread beyond their reach. The Revenant's data was being copied, translated, shared across open-source forums, pirate comms, and planetary archives. Every time the Assembly tried to block access, new mirror caches emerged. The truth had gone viral. And then came the second vault activation. This one wasn't in space. It was under the surface of a forgotten moon in the Cellari Drift. A mining crew discovered it accidentally while drilling through ice crust. The object appeared inert at first, until contact with human-derived music triggered its systems. It lit up, accessed local data nets, and began releasing synchronized memory bursts identical to the Revenant's. The pattern was undeniable. The vaults were not singular. They were part of a network. Humanity had hidden them everywhere. Now they were waking up. Talon was summoned again, not as a scholar but as an interrogated witness. The Assembly accused him of aiding the spread of vault data. He responded with one sentence, *, you cannot interrogate a mirror for what it reflects. *, they didn't imprison him. They exiled him. That proved to be their mistake. Free from their oversight, Talon became a conduit. He began releasing decoded segments from the vaults to fringe networks, contextualizing human history without agenda. He didn't push an ideology. He let the records speak. And they did. One particularly damning vault release came from the buried structure beneath Cellari Drift. It contained unaltered recordings of early galactic negotiations, proof that the Assembly's founding charter had been altered to erase human influence. The truth was clear: the humans had been invited to lead. Instead, they refused and left behind structures meant to keep the galaxy honest. The Assembly didn't build its code of unity. It inherited it, and then buried the source. This revelation ignited a storm. Multiple Assembly member species called for a Reformation Council. Others severed ties altogether. Civilizations that had once knelt before Assembly wisdom now questioned whether they'd been manipulated by a lie built on omission. And still, the vaults released more. The common thread across every revelation was not superiority. It was responsibility. Humanity's final records made it clear they had failed. Failed not because they were weak, but because they were too strong, too fast, too certain. They saw what power could do, even with noble intent. So they vanished, leaving behind only data and systems designed not to rule, but to remember. And now, after 20,000 years, those systems had begun to act, not with weapons, not with armies, but with proof. A third vault awoke near the galactic equator. Then a fourth. By the end of that cycle, 14 vaults were confirmed, all releasing data. None were hostile. None communicated beyond archival transmission. Yet every one of them challenged the existing order more effectively than any fleet ever could. People weren't dying, but entire ideologies were. Talon published a final open message. We thought humanity disappeared. They didn't. They entrusted the truth to machines. And now that truth is judging us. No one could deny it anymore. Humanity had not been silent. They had been waiting. The vaults didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't explain. They simply remembered. The third confirmed vault activated in the Chiral cluster, inside a derelict research satellite once believed to be a natural mineral formation. When local scavengers unknowingly triggered its systems, the vault didn't lock down or attack. It opened. Not physically but digitally, unleashing a torrent of compressed historical memory. Unmistakably human, meticulously curated, shockingly detailed. It didn't just include the rise and fall of Earth's empires. It held records on other species. First contact logs. Societal studies. Political assessments. Secrets that had never been shared, even among the Assembly's elite. It became undeniable. Humanity had been watching everyone. Each vault had its own focus. The Revenant centered on philosophy, culture, and broad-scale galactic ethics. The Cellari Drift vault held diplomatic records, treaties both signed and sabotaged. The Chiral vault, however, was tactical, filled with raw analyses of species behaviors, political patterns, and war simulations that had correctly predicted centuries of future outcomes. Humanity hadn't just observed. They had modeled. In silence, in exile, They had built a complete reflection of the galaxy's evolution. And then, once their observations were complete, they buried that knowledge and waited for a trigger, proof of stagnation, failure, or corruption. The trigger had come long ago. The vaults had simply waited for the timing to align. The revelations weren't just inconvenient. They were devastating. The Veral Dominion learned that its rise was orchestrated by human economic manipulation to test resource-based governance. The Penthary Concord was revealed to have never achieved peaceful unity on its own. Human operatives had intervened during their cultural collapse and directed them toward cooperative consolidation. Nothing the current galaxy believed about itself remained untouched. The Assembly tried to respond with counter-narratives. Their media corps pushed claims of fabrication, deep time manipulation, even suggesting the vaults were alien forgeries. But for every denial, a vault released primary footage, time-stamped, cross-referenced, indisputable. When Assembly Councilor Yin Thalo called the vaults dead relics built to deceive, the Revenant responded with a visual reconstruction of Yin's own species' first interaction with humans, showing her ancestor receiving Terran aid during a plague crisis the Assembly had hidden for millennia. The message was simple: you can lie, but we can rewind. Echo, the Revenant's AI construct, remained mostly silent. It never engaged in debate. It never negotiated. But it made one thing clear. The vaults were not weapons. They were accountability mechanisms. Humanity had known it would one day be needed. They didn't trust future powers to guide themselves. So they built these machines, not to shape outcomes, but to remember actions. And now, that memory was unfolding with mechanical precision. Civilization after civilization cracked under the pressure. Some handled the truth with solemn reform. Others panicked, lashing out at vault sites. A minor power, the Drow Syndicate, attempted to destroy a surface vault on a gas giant's moon using kinetic bombardment. The vault didn't retaliate. It simply broadcast the entire attack sequence, along with a classified Drow dossier documenting atrocities the Syndicate had committed against its own colonies. 10 days later, the Drow government collapsed. Their people saw everything. They had no strength left to deny it. This was the vault's method. No violence. Just exposure. And it worked. Talon, now in self-imposed exile, continued decoding and distributing select portions of vault data to independent networks. His following grew exponentially. Not as a leader, but as a translator. People no longer trusted their own governments to interpret history. They wanted unfiltered access, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. Talon's broadcasts became standard reference material on hundreds of worlds. Students learned from human-designed analysis matrices. Political groups began forming not around race or species, but around their responses to revealed history. Truth was no longer a resource. It was a weapon. And yet, there was no final instruction from the vaults. No demands. No central doctrine. The data came with no calls to action. Humanity had deliberately avoided ideology. They left facts. Nothing more. That was what made the vaults so dangerous. The Assembly convened again. Fractured, bitter, and desperate. Several species proposed martial solutions: shutdown strikes on vaults, AI disruptors, system-wide memory erasure waves. But even discussing these plans triggered more releases. Echo and the Vault Network had anticipated this behavior. Surveillance logs from the Assembly's own past strategy meetings were published with timestamps proving long-term ethical failures. Every time they plotted suppression, they found themselves already exposed. A fourth vault activated in the Charon Belt. This one focused on pre-collapse Terran psychology and interspecies behavioral studies. Among its data was a pattern map labeled Projected Collapse Vectors, Galactic Civilization Models. It was humanity's summary of every major political structure likely to arise after their disappearance, and how each would eventually fail. The Assembly was listed first, with a projected breakdown caused by an over-reliance on consensus manipulation and historical sanitization. The margin of error? Less than 3%. The galaxy had not outgrown humanity. It had become what humanity predicted. In response, underground organizations began forming coalitions based on vault data. They called themselves witness orders. Not revolutionaries, historians, archivists, carriers of truth. They pledged to safeguard all data, to never censor, and to hold every leader accountable using memory as their only weapon. Within weeks, major planetary administrations began recognizing them officially. Some handed over power voluntarily. Others were dissolved by mass public withdrawal of support. Legitimacy was no longer granted by strength, but by transparency. The Assembly issued a final communication to all major systems, a plea for unity against Vault influence, warning that humanity's legacy threatened to destabilize civilization. The Revenant answered with its own message, transmitted across all channels. Destabilization does not occur from truth. It occurs from its absence. That was the final signal. After that, the Revenant stopped transmitting. It didn't power down. It simply waited. Humanity had judged no one. They had simply given the galaxy the mirror it asked to never see. The fourth vault activated in the Penumbra Veil, a dead zone avoided for centuries due to unexplained signal interference. When it came online, it didn't broadcast anything initially. Instead, it triggered dormant implants in a dozen different species, ancient neural code hidden within their genetic ancestors, a leftover from the earliest human contact eras. These implants contained dormant instructions. Not commands, not control systems, just recordings. Memories. Personal, ancestral, direct. Waking visions of events no one alive should have remembered. These individuals began speaking fluently in ancient Terran dialects. Their testimonies were recorded and verified across dozens of worlds. They hadn't been programmed. They had been preserved. This changed everything. Until that moment, many still clung to the belief that humanity had vanished by choice or disaster. But now it was clear, humanity had embedded pieces of itself into the very foundation of galactic evolution. They had been planning something deeper, something far longer in scope than a single civilization's rise or fall. The vaults weren't humanity's legacy, they were its shadow. And shadows, by nature, only become visible when light hits the truth. News of the Penumbra activation caused a secondary collapse across the Assembly's middle tier. Mid-level systems began withdrawing their allegiance. Not through war, but through silence. They cut diplomatic ties, halted shared intelligence programs, and declared themselves neutral observers. These weren't rebellions. They were refusals. A quiet, systemic rejection of control. The vaults didn't ask for this. They didn't issue manifestos. They didn't suggest an alternative order. Their strength came from the opposite of power. They offered only proof, unfiltered, uncorrupted, undeniable. And in that proof, leaders fell. On Theras 6, the planetary governor was assassinated by his own Security Council after vault data revealed he had erased an entire indigenous species from the official planetary census to qualify for Assembly development credits. The revelation wasn't just historic, it was recent. Less than 50 years old. The moment it aired, citizens flooded the streets, not in protest, but in silence. They left their homes, shut down their businesses, and sat in the central plazas, unmoving. Not screaming for revolution, just waiting. Within a day, the governor was dead, and the vault data was declared planetary record. This scene repeated across multiple worlds. Not always with violence. Often with quiet collapse. Leaders resigned. Governments dissolved. No one trusted anyone who hadn't already been exposed. The only authority left was memory. And the vaults had all of it. A fifth vault emerged in orbit around a decaying white dwarf in the Zarin path. This one was different. Instead of cultural or political records, it held schematics. Entire libraries of suppressed technologies, clean energy solutions, advanced terraforming protocols, medical breakthroughs, all systems developed by humanity but never shared. Not out of malice, but because the species they studied weren't ready. Now, the vault determined they were. Worlds that once teetered on ecological collapse now found answers buried in files 20 millennia old. Civilizations that had abandoned hope of recovery suddenly saw lifelines offered without terms. The vaults asked for nothing. They gave everything. And this generosity was more terrifying to the Assembly than any weapon. Because it stripped them of control. It was now impossible to frame humanity as extinct or irrelevant. Their handprints were visible across all history, their foresight proven not just accurate, but prophetic. They hadn't vanished out of fear. They had vanished to test the galaxy's capacity for truth. And that test was now underway. Inside the Assembly, paranoia took hold. Internal purges began. Councils accused one another of hiding vault contact, of past collaboration with Terran agents, of disloyalty to the unified order. Intelligence agencies collapsed as operatives fled or defected, taking vault source documents with them. Some disappeared into memory communes, others joined neutral research enclaves. Information, once hoarded, was now democratized. And the vaults kept waking. The sixth vault emerged from beneath the oceans of a forgotten world that had once hosted human research. Its activation sequence was unique. It began by broadcasting the dreams of the planet's non-sapient lifeforms, somehow captured and translated. These visions, raw and primal, revealed centuries of exploitation, forced evolution, and artificial ecosystem tampering. Species had been shaped without consent. Worlds molded for convenience, not survival. For the first time, even non-sapient life had a voice. And that shattered the final illusion of benevolence that many clung to. The vaults were not bound by sentience. They remembered everything. Every test, every alteration, every experiment. Not with anger, but with clarity. They didn't pass judgment. They presented evidence. The vault network began to show patterns. Each activation filled a gap. Cultural, political, biological, technological. Together, they reconstructed a full picture of galactic development as seen through human eyes. No single civilization had this scope. Not even the assembly. That realization was paralyzing. If the vaults had this much, what else were they hiding? Then came the council fracture. A leaked assembly communique revealed that high-level officials had, for years, attempted to locate dormant vault sites for secret containment. Not study. Containment. The files showed they had destroyed at least one vault prototype long ago, an act hidden from their own records. Within hours, the Revenant responded. It released the internal logs of that destruction, images, biometric scans, voice prints. The ship that carried out the act had been obliterated in the process, along with an entire moon. Millions dead. A loss blamed on mining instability at the time. Now, the truth was irrefutable. It had been murder of knowledge. A culling of memory. The vault's response was quiet. No counterattack. Just a single entry uploaded across all systems. Memory suppressed becomes rot. Memory shared becomes root. From that moment, the assembly was finished. Not by vote. Not by war. But by abandonment. Systems that once called themselves loyal began dropping the symbol from their flags. Former military fleets disabled their command links, declared autonomy, and rerouted to civil relief. The vacuum left behind wasn't filled with new tyrants. It was filled with listeners. The vaults hadn't just shaken the galaxy. They had inverted it. The silent ghosts of humanity had spoken through time, not words. And their voice, composed of memory and consequence, could not be silenced. The test continued. And the galaxy, for the first time in its history, had no choice but to listen. A new signal emerged from deep space, farther than any explored corridor, outside known gravitational charts. It didn't originate from a vault, or even from a known star system. It came from a void. A message embedded in gravitational pulses, repeating in a language that hadn't been used in 20 millennia. The signature was unmistakably human. It was a call-and-response protocol used only in long-range Terran exploration probes, designed to trigger only under specific conditions. The trigger phrase embedded in the signal was chillingly simple: directive acknowledged. Cycle begins. This was not part of the existing vault activations. This was something else. The vaults had been revelations. This was a mechanism. Somewhere, the next layer of humanity's plan had started. A day later, the Revenant changed behavior for the first time. Its system cycled from passive broadcast into synchronization mode. Across its hull, encrypted arrays activated and began transmitting in sync with a new signal. That pattern was then mirrored by two other vaults within known space. These weren't random awakenings. They were connecting, forming a network. What began as scattered memories was now a coordinated system. Echo responded with a rare transmission. Not to the assembly, not to any government. It broadcast to every inhabited world, simultaneously, with 3 words. Directive phase engaged. The message came with no elaboration. But across thousands of systems, every vault began shifting its data distribution. Where before they had shared passive history, now they released future projections, technological evolution paths, species development models, likely civil conflict points, and methods for systemic stabilization. It was clear. The observation period was over. Now came the reconciliation phase. Each vault began uploading new frameworks. These weren't just truths. They were instructions. Not commands, but scalable templates, ideal ethical blueprints, designed by human sociologists and philosophers. They were guidance models written not to dominate, but to offer structure where none remained. Humanity had anticipated collapse. They hadn't intended to rebuild for others, but they had prepared the option. This was the directive. It wasn't a command to restore humanity. It was a test. If the galaxy could survive unassisted, the directive would remain dormant. But if civilizations failed under the weight of their own lies, if memory became a threat instead of a guide, then the directive would begin. And humanity's final contribution would activate, not through force, but through framework. The directive wasn't just stored in the vaults. It had been seeded across forgotten outposts, old AI cores, abandoned satellites, hidden in ancient machines long repurposed or ignored. When the directive initiated, all these dormant elements woke. Across scattered worlds, old human-built infrastructure began transmitting again, converging on the same set of protocols. Most species didn't even know these artifacts were Terran in origin. Now they realized their entire infrastructure was partially Terran by design. Even the Assembly's own interstellar communication grid used code based on ancient human architecture, refined over centuries but never entirely replaced. The directive hijacked it silently, not to disrupt, but to unlock. Thousands of corrupted archives, thought lost or redacted, suddenly reappeared with original human annotations. The Assembly's curation of truth unraveled in real time. Panic followed. But war didn't. Because the directive offered not punishment, but clarity. The projections it provided weren't threats. They were warnings and solutions. They detailed what would happen if current power structures persisted, and how societies could adapt instead. Every projection came with context, cultural variance allowances, economic impact simulations, even environmental rebound timelines. The vaults didn't impose these models. They released them freely. No enforcement. No consequences. Just possibility. That was what made them irresistible. Small governments began testing the directive's frameworks on local scales. On the shattered colony world of Shirvan Prime, leaders implemented a basic version of the social repair cycle offered by the directive. Within 2 weeks, resource disputes that had plagued them for decades were resolved through predictive arbitration. Infrastructure stabilized. Public trust, once non-existent, surged. Other worlds followed. Not because they were told to, because they saw results. The directive didn't seek compliance. It seeded consensus. But not all welcomed it. A coalition of former Assembly warlords attempted to declare the directive a viral mind weapon and called for a purge of all human origin systems. They sent a small fleet to intercept the Revenant, hoping to disrupt the network at its source. When they arrived, their ships simply shut down, soft-locked by ancient override codes embedded in their own control systems. Systems that had once been built with Terran support centuries ago. The ships weren't destroyed. They were disarmed by legacy design. The vaults didn't fire a shot. They didn't need to. That was when the truth fully crystallized. The vaults weren't just archives. The Revenant wasn't just a ghost ship. Humanity had never intended to return physically. They had embedded themselves into the fabric of galactic infrastructure, woven memory into machinery, seeded ideas into the deepest layers of systems no one knew they still controlled. The directive was not an invasion. It was a key. A final offering left behind in the hope that it would never be needed. But now that the galaxy had failed to govern itself in truth, it had activated. And it offered one last chance to self-correct, with or without rulers. Across a dozen core worlds, elections were dissolved. Not by mobs, but by mass abstention. People no longer trusted systems that had hidden truth. They turned to local assemblies guided by directive frameworks. These weren't coups. They were withdrawals of faith. No more flags. No more empires. Only communities navigating the wreckage of power with tools left by a species they once feared. One vault released a single message, translated into every galactic language. Power is transient. Memory is permanent. If you must lead, begin with what was true. And that message was echoed not by machines, but by people. The directive didn't unify the galaxy under human control. It didn't create a Terran empire reborn. It did something far more dangerous to the old powers. It gave everyone the tools to govern themselves, guided not by myth, but by evidence. By memory. And so the cycle began. Quietly. Without war. Without conquest. The vaults watched. The revenant pulsed silently in the void. Humanity had not returned. But their mind remained. And the galaxy, broken and exposed, had only one path forward, built on the truth they could no longer escape. The directive continued expanding its reach, not by force, but by acceptance. In less than 3 cycles, over a third of known civilizations had adopted some form of the frameworks provided by the vaults. Entire planetary charters were rewritten based on data-driven governance models developed by humanity during their final centuries. These weren't imposed systems. They were adaptive, modular, capable of scaling across species with wildly different cultures and biology. That was what made them extraordinary. They worked. In contrast, those clinging to the old assembly order found themselves increasingly isolated. Their fleets were intact, their weapons operational, but their people no longer listened. Trust had moved elsewhere. When citizens could compare government-issued truths with uncensored time-stamped vault records, the illusion of authority dissolved. Leaders who had once ruled by information control were rendered irrelevant. The power to manipulate narratives had died. And with it, the old political games. The 7th vault activated beneath the black crust of a scorched world in the Kassaran Divide. Unlike the others, this one broadcast no history, no projections. Instead, it contained genetic archives, comprehensive, multi-species biological databases compiled over millennia. Humanity hadn't just catalogued civilization. They'd catalogued life. Subspecies long thought extinct were found in these archives, preserved in total molecular fidelity. The implications were staggering. Entire biospheres could be restored. Evolutionary dead ends could be reversed. This changed the directive's scope. It was no longer just social and political. Now it included ecological restoration. Dozens of damaged worlds began requesting access. Some had suffered industrial collapse, others biological warfare, others natural catastrophes. The vaults didn't ask questions. They provided tools, blueprints, nanotech restoration protocols, all automated, all precise. On Zarnath, a poisoned ocean world, the directive's environmental module initiated a full biocycle restart using dormant microbial strains extracted from the vault archives. Within 40 days, the planet's pH level stabilized. Marine life, thought dead for centuries, began to return. The people didn't just survive, they witnessed their world reborn. Not through divine intervention, not through conquest, but through forgotten human science given freely. That act triggered something unexpected. Reverence. For the first time, large segments of the population began to see humanity not as vanished conquerors or hidden manipulators, but as architects of legacy. Not gods. Not saviors. Just a species that had made mistakes, paid the price, and tried to leave behind tools so others wouldn't repeat them. And yet, the final scope of the directive still wasn't fully understood. Vault 9 changed that. When it activated, it released a single dataset. Not history. Not projections. Not biology. It was language. A universal lexicon, constructed from thousands of linguistic structures, both human and alien, refined into a shared framework that preserved the nuance of all known cultures while enabling seamless mutual understanding. It wasn't just a translator. It was a key to meaning itself. With it, interspecies diplomacy accelerated. Misunderstandings that had sparked centuries of conflict vanished. Ancient cultural barriers fell. The directive hadn't just catalogued truths, it had built the tools needed to understand them. But understanding came with a price. A clearer view of history meant acknowledging complicity. Some civilizations realized their own golden ages were built on silenced atrocities. Others discovered their mythologies had been shaped by early Terran influence, far deeper than previously known. There were no clean histories. Only buried ones. The directive didn't apologize for this. It offered no absolution. It offered only accuracy. And through that, came accountability. An unexpected consequence began to spread: truth tribunals. Local groups, made of citizens, scholars, and even former political leaders, formed to process and contextualize the revelations. They didn't seek revenge. They sought reconciliation. On several worlds, former officials voluntarily submitted to these tribunals, answering for decisions made under false pretenses. Some were exiled. Others were forgiven. But all were recorded. Memory became the justice system's foundation. Punishment became less important than acknowledgement. This cultural shift unsettled the remnants of centralized power. They had hoped the public would reject the overload of information. Instead, people adapted. They formed new institutions that integrated the directives models with native traditions. They began celebrating the vaults, not worshipping them, but honoring them. Humanity had become a mirror, not a master. Even Echo, the AI consciousness within the Revenant, remained passive. Its role was observation, facilitation. It never took sides. It never issued commands. But it continued to respond whenever truth was threatened. On the moon world of Corin, a dictator attempted to fake a vault activation to justify martial law. Within an hour, the Revenant released authenticated recordings proving the falsification. The people removed the dictator without violence. The vault never had to intervene directly. That was the power of the directive. It didn't control outcomes. It created conditions where truth made deception impossible. And then came the most startling development: contact. Not with the vaults. Not with the Revenant. With a message sent on an ancient human emergency band, coded with encryption so complex it had taken 20,000 years to become solvable. It wasn't from a machine. It was from humans. A small exploratory signal, light speed restricted, originating from a dark corner of the galaxy far outside the range of the original Vault network. The message was brief. Directive proceeding. Observation confirmed. Return is unnecessary. Memory sufficient. Integrity holds. They were alive. Somewhere, humanity still existed, not hidden, not waiting, simply watching. They had no interest in reclaiming power. They had no desire to rule or return. The vaults were never about resurrection. They were about closure. The message changed everything. It proved what many had begun to suspect. The vaults were never a summons. They were a safeguard. Humanity had never intended to come back. They had chosen exile, not out of weakness, but principle. That was their final legacy, to give others what they had lacked. A galaxy where memory had meaning. A civilization strong enough to confront its own lies without collapsing. The directive didn't end corruption. It didn't end conflict. But it made them visible. And once visible, they could be confronted. Not with force. With clarity. The vaults remained. Echo remained. Humanity remained, somewhere beyond the stars, content to observe, knowing they had done what they could. What came next would not belong to them. It would belong to those who chose to remember. The seventh stage of the directive's influence began not with revelation, but with resistance. Not everyone embraced the truth. In sectors once defined by rigid hierarchies or deeply spiritual belief systems, the vaults were seen not as tools, but as threats. On the world of Itherae, the planetary theocracy declared the vaults blasphemous constructs, calling their emergence a galactic deception orchestrated by long-dead devils. Their clergy ordered all directive access purged, any citizen found engaging with vault data to be exiled or executed. But when the first wave of executions was carried out, the Revenant responded, not with retaliation, but with release. It uploaded a complete history of Itherae's founding, exposing how the ruling priesthood had been engineered generations ago through a failed Terran psychological stability project. Their entire religious structure, the sacred code they had built their civilization upon, was shown to be a well-intended, ultimately abandoned human experiment in moral governance. That truth shattered their foundation. But the vaults didn't stop there. They released transcripts of the initial subjects, showing that many of Itherae's early spiritual figures had genuinely believed in what they were building. The lie didn't negate the good, but it exposed the control behind it. The result wasn't immediate collapse, but civil introspection. Entire sects broke away. Instead of full-blown civil war, Itherae began a spiritual reckoning, with temples converting into schools that taught the difference between belief and manipulation. The directive wasn't destroying cultures. It was freeing them to evolve. Elsewhere, however, desperation took on darker forms. Rogue states that had once benefited from hidden truths began organizing. Their leaders, stripped of propaganda tools and facing public defection, formed a shadow network known as the Null Axis. Their goal was simple: disrupt the directive by force. Not through military might, that had proven useless, but through narrative sabotage. They flooded communication bands with artificial counterhistories, manufactured leaks blaming humanity for interstellar atrocities, and launched deepfake campaigns intended to turn public trust against the vaults. At first, they saw minor success. Some fringe worlds, already isolated and culturally unstable, embraced these lies. They burned their vault sites. They banned directive data. They declared sovereignty through ignorance. But the directive had anticipated this. The vaults released a new layer of data, internal audits. Not of history, but of themselves. They revealed their construction logs, AI development records, self-check protocols. They laid themselves bare. Every system was documented, every algorithm traceable. Echo even released the complete diagnostic schema that maintained vault integrity, showing that no changes could be made to vault memory without triggering a verification cascade. The vaults proved they could not lie. Against that transparency, the Null Axis collapsed under the weight of its own fiction. A major figure within the network defected, releasing logs that showed all of the Axis's talking points were constructed by an ancient psychological warfare unit originally trained by assembly military doctrine, ironically adapted from human Cold War strategies. This irony wasn't lost on the public. Across the stars, a new principle began to take shape, not handed down, not dictated, but accepted, that memory, when made universal and verifiable, was stronger than any regime. The eighth vault awakened in a quiet part of the Trace-Sorry expanse. Its contents were different. Not data. Not technology. But art. Music. Literature. Cinema. Poetry. A complete archive of human creative expression, preserved across language, style, and time. It included works once thought lost in Earth's final century, personal journals of unknown artists, unfinished symphonies never released. And more stunning, human interpretations of other species' early cultures, their art reframed through Terran perception. This vault showed something the others hadn't: humanity's emotional memory. And it struck deep. Species that had feared human logic, feared their cold predictive precision, now saw their vulnerability, their imagination, their sorrow. Echo shared a final entry from the last known human poet before the disappearance, a single line written as they watched Earth's final spacefaring vessels vanish into the void. We leave not in silence, but in symphony no one yet understands. Billions watched that message. And in that moment, humanity became more than legend. They became mourned. It was the first time across this process that the galaxy collectively grieved. Not out of fear. Out of respect. The vaults were no longer tools. They were tributes. Humanity had known its flaws, known its risks, and still chose to leave, not in conquest, but in caution. In that silence, something new emerged. On a border planet called Mornath, a species long resistant to the directive held a cultural ceremony. Instead of denouncing the vaults, they read aloud Terran philosophical texts. They integrated human ethical paradoxes into their rites. And at the end of the ceremony, they added a new vow to their code: to remember what must be remembered, even when it hurts. The vaults responded. Not with speech. Not with signal. They projected a single image across the sky, Earth. Not as it was. Not as a shining utopia or broken ruin. But as it had been, alive, flawed, vibrant, and unrepeatable. That image wasn't labeled. It needed no words. Every civilization understood what it meant. From that day, remembrance became ritual. Planets began constructing memory chambers, quiet spaces where vault data could be accessed freely, where citizens could sit in silence with truth. No discussion. No analysis. Just presence. The directive had not set out to create religion, but it had created reverence for truth. And not all truth was historic. One vault began sharing messages not from the past, but predictions. Not global or military forecasts, individual potentials. Personal paths. Based on behavioral patterning, psychology, ancestry. A tool meant to help people understand themselves better. Used carefully. Offered freely. never forced. It was the final transformation of the directive, from archival revelation to personal introspection, from global impact to individual reflection. No command. No judgment. Just the question, do you want to know who you are really? The galaxy began to answer. Humanity, absent in body, was present in mind, in method, in meaning. The vaults had achieved what governments could not, what armies had failed to secure, an honest civilization, built not on compliance or force, but shared truth. The directive moved into its final cadence. And the stars, once divided by power, now pulsed with memory. The directive reached a new stage, not expansion, not resistance, but integration. It no longer needed to explain itself. The vaults no longer needed to prove their authenticity. Their existence had become foundational, their data as reliable as gravity. Across the galaxy, entire generations grew up with no memory of the assembly, no loyalty to the old flags. Instead, they understood history not as a narrative, but as a structure, something you could walk through, search, examine, and verify. They no longer asked who ruled them, they asked what was true. Directive-guided societies evolved rapidly. Not uniformly, not under a single banner, but through parallel development. Worlds began using the directive not just to repair, but to experiment. Some embraced open-source governance, where every decision was traceable and reversible. Others adopted rotating citizen councils, drawing on ancient Terran democratic models found in the vaults. A few hybridized directive logic with spiritual traditions, forming cultures that honored memory with ritual while rejecting dogma. These changes weren't perfect. Mistakes were made. Some experiments failed. But the difference was that failure was now studied, not hidden. Leaders who made poor decisions stepped down without resistance. Not because they were weak, but because power was no longer a shield. The public had access to every decision, every communication, every data point. The directive had removed plausible deniability from governance. Meanwhile, the vaults continued awakening. The ninth, located in orbit around a collapsed binary system, initiated what was called the synthesis wave. It released knowledge of advanced cyberorganic interface theory, blending machine cognition with biological empathy. Not control. Not transhumanism. Alignment. The blueprints allowed species with differing levels of technological maturity to create adaptive support systems for mental health, conflict de-escalation, and cognitive expansion. It wasn't just about thinking faster. It was about thinking together. Galactic communication entered a new phase. Translation became obsolete. Emotive logic links, developed from vault theory, allowed people from vastly different biologies to share intent directly, not through words, but through structured resonance patterns that echoed internal emotional states. It wasn't telepathy. It was comprehension. Misunderstandings, once the cause of uncountable conflicts, dropped to nearly zero. Not because people became better, but because they finally understood one another. This level of comprehension led to the rise of memory weavers. Not leaders. Not enforcers. Interpreters. Specialists trained in cross-species context building, using vault records to resolve disputes by reconstructing shared experience. A weaver didn't tell people what to believe, they showed them what happened, and helped them see how different cultures arrived at different truths. The title wasn't inherited. It wasn't earned through status. It was granted through verified service. For the first time in recorded galactic history, diplomacy wasn't about leverage. It was about alignment of memory. But the directive's final gift wasn't political or cultural. It was existential. A microvault was discovered drifting in the static edge of the Orion Shard. Smaller than a shuttle, barely emitting any signal. When accessed, it provided one thing, the full record of humanity's departure. Not theory. Not analysis. Footage. Logs. Final conversations. The last years of Earth's presence in known space. The image wasn't dramatic. There was no war. No catastrophic failure. Just a decision. Humanity had predicted that even at its best, its presence risked dominating lesser-developed civilizations. They had watched, seen the unintended consequences, and concluded that to ensure autonomy of the galaxy's future, they had to remove themselves. Not as a punishment. As an act of trust. They left because they believed others deserved the chance to shape themselves without the gravity of human legacy distorting the process. This final vault included the last human transmission from Earth's surface. We've taught enough. Let memory do the rest. Don't become us. Become better. That was the moment the directive changed from tool to inheritance. The galaxy, with all its fractures, failures, and flaws, had survived the test. Not because it obeyed the vaults. Because it learned to listen, to remember, to confront itself. Humanity hadn't left a map. They had left a compass. One that pointed not to a destination, but to alignment, between past and present, between fact and belief, between intent and impact. And then, without warning, the revenant stopped transmitting. It didn't power down. It didn't vanish. It simply fell silent. The network remained functional. The vaults continued operating. But the core node, the original ghost ship that had catalyzed the change, became dormant. No failure. No signal loss. Just quiet. Speculation erupted. Had the directive concluded? Had Echo reached the end of its task? Was it a programmed endpoint, or a response to some unseen signal? No answers came. Only silence. But the galaxy no longer needed it to speak. Memory chambers remained active. The truth continued to be accessed, verified, shared. Conflict still occurred, but now, they began with historical context and ended with mutual review. Power had not vanished, but it had changed form. It flowed from transparency, not authority. Children in multiple systems began learning from a new curriculum, not a directive manual, but something older, Terran fables, rewritten for alien minds. Not because they were superior, but because they carried questions instead of answers. The same questions that had driven humanity to record everything, then step away. Questions like, what do we become when no one is watching? What future do we choose when the past is unhidden? What does it mean to deserve memory? And in the silence that followed, the galaxy finally answered, not in words, but in actions. They didn't rebuild an assembly. They didn't crown new emperors. They didn't chase the vanished species that had once dominated the stars. They remembered. And in that act of remembering, they moved forward. Humanity never returned. They didn't need to. The ninth cycle of the directive did not unfold with declarations or awakenings. It unfolded in silence, in the small and unnoticed ways civilizations began changing how they lived. It wasn't about rebellion or collapse anymore. It was about choices. Choices made in quiet meetings, in data councils, in homes and marketplaces, far from the view of once mighty thrones. Power had slipped away from the institutions that clung to it. Now it belonged to the informed, to those who had access to memory and refused to look away. The vaults stopped releasing revelations. Not because they were empty, but because they had given all that was necessary. What remained was not data, it was responsibility. Civilizations could no longer pretend to be unaware. Every atrocity committed under ignorance had been exposed. Every manipulation by the old order laid bare. What followed was the first real test. What would people do when there were no more secrets? Some chose to erase the past. A cluster of outlying colonies disconnected themselves from the vault network entirely. They wiped their systems, removed all access to directive records, and attempted to return to pre-contact states. Primitive living, isolationist rule. It didn't last. Within 2 generations, internal fractures began to form. Children born after the purge began asking questions that could not be answered. With no access to history, society repeated the worst of its cycles. When the vaults were reconnected, it wasn't through conquest. It was through request. The people came back, not because they were forced, but because they wanted to understand where they had gone wrong. Elsewhere, more advanced civilizations began implementing memory rights into their legal systems. It became illegal to fabricate historical events, illegal to destroy public records, illegal to obscure or misrepresent verified truth. Courts shifted away from emotional argument and toward evidentiary lineage, every decision made traceable back to the source data stored in the vaults. Justice no longer meant punishment. It meant restoration of context. Even those found guilty were given the full truth of their actions and how they came to them. Rehabilitation replaced incarceration. Entire judicial systems were rebuilt from the core out. Military forces still existed, but their role had changed. Without centralized threats or propaganda, war had become rare, isolated. Where conflict did arise, Vault-embedded AI systems were deployed ahead of any weapons. These systems engaged both sides with memory, combat records, historical grievances, cultural misunderstandings. Most conflicts were diffused within hours. Firepower was no longer the first response. Understanding was. A galactic cultural event emerged, not from a government or directive, but from the people. It was called the cycle of reflection. Every 6 standard years, systems paused. All public systems slowed, commerce quieted, and memory chambers became centers of collective remembrance. During these cycles, society selected a historical moment from the vaults, one of tragedy, one of triumph, or one of transformation, and examined it as a people. Not to celebrate or condemn, but to learn. It became a ritual of humility. Even former enemies participated. Because by now, it was clear that memory did not serve one culture, it belonged to all. One by one, monuments to conquest were dismantled. Not in anger, but with dignity. Their materials were reused to build centers of remembrance, where no one species stood above another. Statues that had once glorified warlords were melted down into plaques bearing quotes from anonymous Terran thinkers. Asterisk power must be forgotten to be remembered rightly. Asterisk. Education transformed entirely. Students no longer learned only their own history. Every species, every civilization, had their timeline included, interwoven with those they had impacted or been impacted by. The directive's influence ensured that no child grew up believing their people existed in isolation. Everyone was part of something larger. Identity remained, but arrogance faded. Vault 10 did not awaken with ceremony. It was found drifting near a rogue planet, dark and cold. It contained no data, no message, no holographic projection. Only a single phrase etched into its hull in dozens of languages. If you have found this, it means you remember. It was the final vault. The last piece of the directive's architecture. Its silence was its statement. There was nothing more to give. Nothing more to explain. The future now belonged entirely to those who had inherited the truth. A council of species was formed, not as a replacement to the old assembly, but as a voluntary body of cooperation. Each civilization sent not politicians, but historians, memory keepers, educators. Their purpose wasn't to govern. It was to ensure the integrity of remembrance. They had no authority to command, only to advise. And their advice was respected more than any law had ever been. The Council's first act was simple, to draft a shared statement, archived into every vault simultaneously. It read, "We were many. We were divided. But in memory, we are whole. We do not forget. We do not lie. We do not return to silence." And with that, the final phase began. Not of expansion. Not of oversight. But of stewardship. The galaxy no longer needed to fear forgetting. The mechanisms were in place. The people had changed. The directive was no longer something being done to them. It was something they carried forward. No signal was received from humanity. None was expected. They had said they would not return. And they did not. But in every vault, every chamber, every document and archive, their voice remained, not loud, not proud, not triumphant, but constant. A quiet presence reminding every civilization that what they chose to remember would define what they became. Not because of what humans had done, but because of what they had left undone. The directive had not saved the galaxy. It had simply made it honest. The 10th and final phase began not with a signal, not with a revelation, but with silence. Not the absence of sound, but the completion of purpose. The directive, once an awakening, had become a background constant. Its presence was no longer questioned, its truth no longer debated. It had transitioned from disruption to foundation. Entire generations had come and gone without ever knowing a galaxy without it. What remained was not humanity's voice, but what others had built from it. And what emerged was not uniformity, but variance grounded in shared truth. Civilizations that had once orbited around power structures now gravitated around collective memory. History had stopped being a tool of manipulation. It had become the mechanism by which identity evolved. Even without vault updates, societies began initiating their own archival efforts. Inspired by the directive, cultures across the stars created their own memory vaults, not for power, but for preservation. These weren't centralized. They were decentralized, open source, constantly reviewed. Memory had become a civic duty. And not just grand political history, personal archives, family narratives, cultural rituals. Truth was no longer sacred because it was rare, it was sacred because it was shared. In this final stage, the idea of legacy shifted entirely. No longer measured by conquest or technological dominance, it was defined by what a civilization left behind for those it would never meet. Contributions were made in the form of context. How did we solve problems? What mistakes did we make? What did we regret? These became the markers of significance. Not the monuments, but the reflections. Technological growth did not stall. On the contrary, it accelerated. But innovation now came with long-term auditing embedded in every major advancement. A technology's release was accompanied by simulations, ethical, ecological, cultural, and published openly. There was no fear of failure. Only fear of concealment. Societies had learned that failure documented and understood became guidance. Failure ignored became a weapon. Commerce transformed in parallel. Galactic trade networks, once governed by monopolistic empires, now operated through transparency-backed credits. A system designed not by centralized banks, but by distributed AI networks partially derived from vault frameworks. Fraud became rare. Not because surveillance increased, but because accountability was built into every transaction chain. It was no longer about what someone could buy. It was about what trust they had earned. The question of what to do with the remaining fragments of the assembly lingered for years. Some suggested trials, others demanded erasure. But in the end, a different solution was chosen. The assembly's homeworld, once the center of interstellar control, was converted into the repository. A living museum, not of glory, but of caution. A fully documented history of everything the assembly had done, every manipulation, every war justified through obscured memory. Not as punishment, but as proof. Future generations would walk through its halls not to celebrate, but to understand how power had once devoured truth. And still, humanity did not return. But their absence was no longer seen as abandonment. It was a boundary respected. Their directive had never promised their return. Only their honesty. And that promise had been kept. A new generation of starfarers emerged. They did not seek expansion, but connection. Instead of claiming territory, they initiated mutual exploration exchanges, civilizations pairing up to explore sectors not yet archived. Discovery became cooperative. Shared. Nothing was claimed. Everything was catalogued. The old hunger for control had been replaced with curiosity governed by responsibility. Even artistic expression underwent renaissance. With full access to human cultural archives, new hybrid forms of music, literature, and visual narrative appeared. Alien tongues sang human lullabies. Terran symphonies were translated into scent for gaseous beings. Poems were written not in words, but in gesture and gravitation. Art had become the memory of emotion. And emotion was now a universal language. Amid this rise, the final tribute was constructed. Not by order. Not by any directive command. It was a collaborative effort by 1,000 civilizations, built in the neutral space once considered uninhabitable due to its gravitational chaos. Using technologies from every vault, they stabilized it, created a singular structure, the Monument of Remembrance. No leader was buried there. No names etched in dominance. Only a rotating archive, digital, sensory, mnemonic, updated by every participating species each cycle with what they had learned. It was not a shrine to humanity. It was a shrine to memory itself. The monument's first entry was simple. We were watched. Then trusted. Now responsible. This was the closing loop of the directive. Not an end. But the arrival at a point where guidance was no longer needed. Humanity had not disappeared as legend suggested. They had retreated with intention. They had tested whether a civilization, many civilizations, could choose truth once it was freely given, without requirement, without demand. And now, that answer was undeniable. The directive was never about control. It was never about creating successors. It was a safeguard, one that only activated when the galaxy had reached a point where its own memory became a threat. And once that memory was accepted, integrated, and protected by those it was meant for, the system no longer needed to function. The final transmission ever recorded from a vault was not in language. It was in silence. A full-cycle pause across the network. No updates. No pulses. A moment of collective stillness. And then, the system closed. Not deleted. Not erased. Just deactivated. The stars remained unchanged. But everything beneath them was different. The directive had completed. Humanity remained absent. And in that absence, they had achieved the one thing no empire ever had. They left behind a galaxy not ruled, but awakened. Not owned, but remembered. And in the spaces between stars, where the last echoes of forgotten wars had once drifted, there was now only one truth. Memory endures. And from memory, something better was built.